A 21-year-old boy dates a 70-year-old woman, hoping for her life insurance, but is shocked by what he receives. Mrs. Evelyn, a 70-year-old retired schoolteacher, lived alone in a charming suburban house. She had 4 children who rarely visited her. She felt lonely but didn't force her children to visit. Since her house was large, she had help from a cleaning lady and a cook who came every day. Mrs. Evelyn was a widow, and her husband had left behind various assets, jewelry, properties, and a well-stocked bank account. However, she hid most of her fortune, even from her children, and the exact amount she possessed was a mystery known only to her. Mrs. Evelyn often called her children and grandchildren, but her calls were almost always ignored, except by Emily, her granddaughter. Emily was the one who paid the most attention to Mrs. Evelyn, but due to her busy schedule as a freelance writer, she rarely visited her grandmother. However, she always called whenever she could to check on her. Mrs. Evelyn had always taken good care of her children, providing them with everything they needed, but after they grew up, they forgot about her. She did not know why they distanced themselves, but she could not do anything about it. Despite her age, Mrs. Evelyn was quite active. She walked every morning, ate well, and talked with her neighbors, but deep down, she longed for the presence of her family. Despite taking care of her health, one day, Mrs. Evelyn slipped on the kitchen floor and hurt her wrist. Her cook rushed her to the hospital. At the hospital, she informed the whole family about what happened, but when they learned that she only hurt her wrist, they did not pay much attention. However, shortly after she arrived at the hospital, her granddaughter rushed to visit her, and her concern was evident. Emily left work as soon as she heard the news and ran to see her grandmother. She asked how she was feeling, if she was in pain, or if she needed anything. Mrs. Evelyn reassured her granddaughter, saying she was fine. Her wrist hurt a little, but the doctors gave her pain medication, and it would soon pass. Mrs. Evelyn spent the night in the hospital, with her granddaughter sleeping in a chair beside her bed. But Evelyn was awake. Her wrist occasionally hurt, but nothing compared to the pain of none of her other children visiting her. She spent the night looking at the door of her hospital room, hoping someone else would come to see her, but no one else showed up. For a moment, Mrs. Evelyn cried but then wiped her tears and thanked for having a wonderful granddaughter by her side. From that day on, she told herself she would not be sad about what she lacked but would be happy for what she had and be grateful for having her granddaughter by her side. Due to the medication, Mrs. Evelyn was tired and needed rest. She was discharged, but the doctor said she would probably need physical therapy for her wrist. Emily took her grandmother home, and they finally rested there. Emily took a few days off work to take care of her grandmother. Mrs. Evelyn said it was unnecessary, but Emily insisted. Finally, Mrs. Evelyn gave in and let her granddaughter stay a few days at her house. It was the beginning of the month, and Emily needed to handle some bank matters for Mrs. Evelyn. Since she trusted her granddaughter a lot, she gave her the account password. Emily went to the bank and took care of everything for Mrs. Evelyn. However, when she opened the bank account, Emily was shocked. She knew her grandmother had received a lot of money from her husband, but the amount in the account startled her. After resolving everything, she immediately went to speak with her grandmother. Emily told her what she saw, but Mrs. Evelyn told her not to mention it to anyone. Emily obeyed her grandmother and said she would not say anything but asked her grandmother to promise to call her if she needed any help. Her grandmother promised to keep her informed. The next morning the personal trainer arrived. He was a 21-year-old young man named Jason. He was very attentive to Mrs. Evelyn. They talked a lot during the session until he left. However, the next day he was there again for a new session. He asked about Mrs. Evelyn's life and always praised her house, which was quite large and luxurious. Evelyn loved having company and also loved that he asked about her life. She spent a lot of time alone, so it was great to have good company. Jason said he lived alone because his parents were from another state and that he had always been independent. After several sessions, Jason invited Evelyn to dinner. She was shocked because she wondered how a young man like him could want something with her, so she immediately refused. However, Jason smiled and said that the body ages, but the spirit always remains young and that she should give happiness a chance. Mrs. Evelyn was really moved by what he said and ended up accepting. Over time they developed a somewhat different romance. They went out for dinner. Evelyn bought clothes for him and herself as well. They shared secrets, but Evelyn never told him about her current financial situation until he moved into her house. When that happened, her children immediately came to speak with her. They all thought it was wrong and that he was only after her money. However, Evelyn stood firm and said he would stay. Emily was sad because she wanted to see her grandmother happy, but she agreed with the rest of the family. She also thought he only wanted the comfort she provided. It had been years since she had seen her grandmother like that. Time passed, and one day Mrs. Evelyn called Emily to talk. She said she needed her help because she was going to do something that would shock everyone. Emily listened attentively to what her grandmother said. After hearing her grandmother's outburst and what she wanted to do next, Emily said she would help her with anything she needed. A few days later, Emily posted in the family group that Mrs. Evelyn was going to sell her house and move to a simpler apartment. Immediately, the whole family went to her house. Her 4 children asked what was happening. She then said she was broke, and all the money her husband had left was gone. Therefore, she would sell the house and move to a simpler place to save money. Emily confirmed everything her grandmother said. She mentioned that her grandmother's bank account was almost empty and that the house was worth a lot of money and that money would help her sustain herself. Jason was also listening and seemed unaware of what was happening. Then the children asked about their share of the house. At that moment, Mrs. Evelyn became furious. She said that when she ended up in the hospital, none of them except Emily visited her, but now that she was selling the house, everyone showed up wanting their share. She said she would give them nothing and that they would only have a right to anything when she passed away. Everyone fell silent and had to respect her wishes. The next day, Mrs. Evelyn packed her bags to leave the house. Jason appeared that day and only sent a message saying he had to travel because his parents needed him. Evelyn told her granddaughter that she never even kissed Jason. She realized he only wanted her money, but in a moment of loneliness, she ended up buying clothes, a new cell phone, and various things for him because she felt lonely. But she realized he was only interested in her money. When she mentioned that she had life insurance and could name anyone on it a few days later, he asked if she could include him in her will because he wanted to dedicate himself only to her. She said yes, she would put his name in the will. Emily was shocked to hear this, but Mrs. Evelyn smiled maliciously and said she would leave something much better for him. Mrs. Evelyn left her house and went to live with her granddaughter. Evelyn spent most of the day alone because Emily worked and studied, but as soon as Emily came home, she gave her grandmother her full attention. Mrs. Evelyn had always had maids to cook for her, but since she was practically alone in the morning and afternoon, she had to cook for herself. However, her neighbor Nathan, a 21-year-old tech enthusiast, almost always brought her lunch and breakfast. He was a kind and polite young man who lived only with his mother. Nathan was looking for a job in tech and therefore spent a lot of time at home. Whenever he could, he helped Evelyn with something around the house. Over time, she started calling him her grandson because she felt a great affection for him, just as she did for Emily. 2 years passed. Emily and Nathan were dating, all thanks to Mrs. Evelyn, who played the role of matchmaker between them. Jason never returned from his trip and never spoke to Mrs. Evelyn again. Age began to take its toll on Evelyn, and some illnesses began to appear over time. Unfortunately, she had to be hospitalized. There, she received constant visits from her granddaughter Emily and her heart grandson Nathan. One day, Evelyn called Emily and said she felt it was near her time to go. Emily said no one knows the time to go, but Evelyn said she felt it was near. Emily cried, and Evelyn told her to cry but not to be sad because she had a happy life. She had children and grandchildren and was very happy, especially in the last 2 years with her granddaughter and the people she considered her family. They hugged each other, and then Mrs. Evelyn laughed and said she just wanted to see everyone's faces on the day of the will reading. A few days later, unfortunately, Mrs. Evelyn passed away. Although her children were not very present in her life, they were all there at the moment she passed. This made her smile because, despite their flaws, they were still her children, and having them by her side at the final moment made her very happy. Nathan and Emily suffered the most because she had been with them every day for the past 2 years. A few days later, Mrs. Evelyn's lawyer held a meeting with everyone to read the will. Jason was also called, and incredibly, he showed up the same day. This made Emily realize that he never actually traveled to visit his parents. He just ran away when he learned that Evelyn had no more money. Everyone was attentive to what the lawyer would say, although the only asset she could have left was her house and her life insurance. The lawyer said that before opening the will, Mrs. Evelyn made it clear that he should play a video for them, which she had recorded. This impressed everyone because it seemed like a movie scene. When the video played and Mrs. Evelyn started speaking, Emily immediately burst into tears, missing her grandmother. In the video, Evelyn said she felt lonely for a long time and that her children rarely visited her, but even so, she would not leave them without support, even though they had comfortable lives. She then thanked Emily for always being by her side for everything. After that, she said she told a big lie, but that lie turned into a dream in her life. She said she called Emily to talk because she felt very lonely, even after Jason appeared in her life. So her granddaughter invited her to spend a few days at her house, but that gave Evelyn an idea. She said she was broke, but in fact, she had full means to continue living where she lived, but she wanted to test her children to see how they would react. Unfortunately, she realized they only wanted her money and nothing more, but even so, she loved them. She intended to stay only a month at her granddaughter's house, but the time she spent with Emily, Nathan, and even the neighbors in the area was the best possible. So she asked if she could live with Emily, and she agreed. In the end, she said that although she divided the inheritance, she loved everyone. Evelyn then made a dramatic pause and said she would state her will. She had a total estate of 5 million, of which 40% would go to her granddaughter Emily. Her house would also be left to her granddaughter. 20% would be given to a charity, and the remaining 40% would be divided among her children. Everyone was shocked, including Emily. She knew her grandmother was a millionaire because that day she saw her bank account, but she never imagined she would leave all that to her. The video still wasn't over. Evelyn finally said she added 2 people who were not her relatives, Nathan and Jason. To Nathan, she left her life insurance worth $700,000. To Jason, she left a key that opened a safe deposit box in a bank where she kept several jewels. Jason, despite thinking he got the smallest share, was happy because he was eager to see what jewels were in that safe. So everyone left. Mrs. Evelyn's children went on with their lives. Emily and Nathan continued living in the same place, although they could move into Evelyn's house. They felt better where they were, so they rented the house. Jason immediately went to the bank to see what was in Evelyn's personal safe with eyes gleaming with happiness. He opened the safe, and inside was a closed cup of cold coffee. Underneath it was a letter. In it she wrote, "My dear Jason, I leave you this cup of coffee that is cold and bitter, just like the love you gave me." Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story.